Gershon Baskin has been involved in hostage negotiations between Israel and Hamas before. He helped secure the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit from Hamas captivity in 2011. That was in exchange for the release of 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. And Gershon can join us now. Really good of you to spare the time for us this afternoon on GB News. Thank you so much. Can you explain to us how devastatingly complicated it is to get these 220 hostages out?
It's extraordinarily difficult because there are no direct contacts between Israel and Hamas, which is the way that it should be done. But of course, that's not done. The Israelis won't talk to Hamas. Hamas won't talk to Israelis. So we need the help of third parties. There are two third parties who are engaged in negotiations. Each one of them has succeeded in freeing two hostages so far, Qatar and Egypt. It's not clear that either Qatar or Egypt has a full communication with all the parties that are involved in holding the hostages. Hamas has a leadership in Doha, in Qatar. They also have a political leadership in Gaza, and there's also the Al-Qassam, which is the military wing of Hamas, who are probably holding most of the hostages. But hostages are also being held apparently by Islamic Jihad, by the PFLP, and by other groups in Gaza. The question is, does Hamas political wing control the hostages, or the military wing, or someone else? The Egyptians are right next to Gaza. Their release that they secured the other night of two elderly women was done with the Al-Qassam, with the military wing of Hamas. Both sides are involved in the negotiations. The Hamas have declared that what they want is a cessation of Israeli bombing on Gaza, but they've also asked for other things, and they're only willing to release what they call the civilian hostages. We don't know what they mean by civilian hostages. They're holding women, children, elderly people, men of different ages, so we don't really know who they're talking about when they say civilian hostages.
So given all this complication, Gershon, and as you've indicated, perhaps a civilian wing, a military wing with different lines of command and a superstructure that's very complicated, what do you make of what Qatar has said this morning, and the Prime Minister? The only way to find a peaceful solution is to keep communication channels open. Hopes there will be a breakthrough on the hostage release soon. Do we take them at their word?
Well, I think that they are trying. I know for a fact that for most of the last 2 weeks, they didn't have direct contact with the Israelis. The Qataris were communicating through the Americans to the Israelis, and that's a bit cumbersome. I understand that in the last day or two, they have had direct communication with the Israelis at a high enough level to make a difference. The Israeli National Security Advisor responded to the message from the Qatari Prime Minister in his own Twitter account, in which he thanked him, which is an indication that at least the National Security Advisor is involved in the talks with the Qataris. This is a very good thing. If the Qataris and the Israelis are talking directly, it will help to streamline the communications. I think that we have reason to hope, but we should be cautious also, because we've been in this situation before. We've never been in a situation where 220 hostages have been taken by one of Israel's enemies. I think it's unprecedented, the nature of the hostages who have been taken around the world. So we need to be cautious, and we don't want to build up expectations, particularly amongst the loved ones, the family members of the hostages. But all avenues need to be exhausted to retrieve hostages before there's an Israeli military incursion on the ground into Gaza, because that once that happens, the window of opportunity for negotiations is probably going to close.
In terms of the sheer number of hostages, that is a lot, isn't it, for captors to look after? So does that mean they might actually be more tempted to release them? Because looking after that many is it's a lot.
Right. It has to be a logistical nightmare for them. They're being probably kept underground in what's been called a web of tunnels that go for probably hundreds of kilometers underneath the entire Gaza Strip. Just having the food, the water, the sanitation, the special needs of people who need medicine. There are people with diabetes, there are people with other illnesses who need to be cared. How much do Hamas care about keeping so many people alive? When they held one Israeli hostage, an Israeli soldier, he was a very valuable asset, and they took very good care of him, making sure that he would be alive because he was worth so much more to them alive than dead. And they did get 1,027 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for him. But with 220 hostages, it's a different calculation.
And that begs the question, of course, given that members of this Al-Qassam brigades indicated that they were told specifically to go and capture people and take them back as hostages when they came over and hit the kibbutzes. What is the end game that they are trying to achieve here? Because one assumes they will have worked out, the likely Israeli response and what they want as a price to pay, if I can use that phrase.
Right. Well, I think that they took many more hostages and hostages of different nature than they originally planned. And that was because of the ease at which they broke through the Israeli border and defenses. I think that was a surprise. And I think that some of the hostage taking was not done by Hamas itself, but by other groups as well. It is against Islam to kill women and children and elderly people. It's against Islam. It's against the Quran to hold women, children, and elderly people as hostages. So they have gone against their own fundamental beliefs, and this should be noted. What do they want in exchange? Well, they've said they want to free all the prisoners, Palestinian prisons, from Israeli prisons. They thought when they broke through Israeli defenses that they were on the road to what they called liberating Palestine. That was said to me directly by several Hamas people in Gaza in the days after the October 7th Saturday attack. They thought that Israel was falling apart, Israel was going to collapse, and they would free Palestine and take over the whole territory. That is obviously not happening, and what they're suffering is enormous losses in Gaza. A humanitarian disaster is being done by Israel dropping bombs indiscriminately on the Gaza Strip, with more than 1.1 million people have lost their homes, and around 6,000 people have already been killed, many of them non-combatants, women and children as well. So this is a horrible disaster that's going on now, and Hamas has overstepped the lines that could be acceptable and has warranted themselves no longer worthy of governing.
Do you think that creates a difficulty in that there may be some arguments going on between the political and the military wings of Hamas that could complicate this further then?
I think for sure that there have to be arguments within Hamas. They show a united front. This could not have been done without agreement of the higher political echelon of the political side of Hamas. It's unthinkable that the military wing could have done such an attack without the agreement and knowledge of the political wing. So they are all collaborative in this, and it's quite difficult to know who in the end of the day is going to make decisions here. I cannot foresee a scenario where at the end of this war, Hamas is in control of Gaza and continues to pose a threat to Israel. I can also not imagine a scenario where there are people holding hostages or alive at the end of this. Many hostages may be sacrificed in the Israeli military plans if they're incapable of negotiating their release. Through the Qataris or through the Egyptians. The Israelis will eventually go into Gaza with their ground forces, and they are prepared for a very difficult battle. But they are prepared, and they're a lot stronger than Hamas.
There is a psychological game, though, isn't there, going on with Hamas? The way they put out that video of Yovshed and Nurit being freed yesterday, and it looked, to all intents and purposes, Yovshed shaking hands with her captor, almost a certain friendliness there. That's what they want people to think, isn't it?
Right, for sure, and we really don't know the circumstances of it. What I can tell you is that Miss Lipschitz is a woman living on the border of Gaza her whole life. She was one of the founders of the kibbutz on the border. She has been a volunteer in an organization which drives Palestinian children to hospitals in Israel. She's been doing that for years. We know that she has always believed that there could be peace between Israel and Palestine, and she has worked for that most of her life. I'm sure that she speaks some Arabic, and she probably know for her own safety that it's better to be on friendly terms with these people than be arrogant with them. And let's remember that her husband is still being held hostage.
And of course, he has been a man of peace as well, and has helped people coming across the border. This might be a tricky one for you, Gershon, but when you worked to release Gilad Shalit back in 2011, it was perhaps a more stable political situation in Israel. There is much discussion about perhaps the differences between the Israeli military and the Israeli government on what happens next. How much of that is a difficulty in terms of securing the release of the hostages?
I don't think that there is an argument between the military and the government. The military takes orders from the government. Netanyahu was forced to bring in more responsible people in the government from the opposition.
This war cabinet,
Right, because people don't trust Netanyahu anymore. In fact, there's a lot of calls for Netanyahu to resign now, and people say in wartime, and people say, yes, remember what happened to Mr. Chamberlain during World War II when Churchill replaced him. So there are precedents for this. Netanyahu does not have the trust of the people, but the army takes orders from the government, and the army will do whatever the government says, and it won't argue with the government. It will present alternatives. It will present scenarios. It will do its job in what it's supposed to do. But at the end of the day, the government will decide, and the army will take the orders.
Gershon, apologies if this is difficult for you to answer, but I just wondered whether it is more likely that we might see this drip feed of hostages, as we've been seeing over the last few days, rather than a big release of them. I know there was talk of some 50 being released altogether. What do you think is the more likely scenario here?
Yeah, I didn't believe that the talk of the 50 release was accurate. There were too many things that were inconsistent with the way that I know that Hamas responds. One is Hamas does not differentiate between Israelis with second passports and Israelis without them. And in fact, the first two women had two passports, and the second two women only had Israeli passports. I think actually that the first two releases we saw was less to do with the Hamas and more of a competition between Qatar and Egypt of who's in charge and who can deliver. Much less to do with the Hamas strategy. I'm not sure there's a coherent Hamas strategy right now on how to release the hostages. I think that they are serious when they said that they would release all the civilian hostages according to their definition. I would be much more pleased if they accepted what I was calling for from the very first days of releasing all the women, the children, the elderly, and the sick. That's much more clear to determine who they are and leaves much less discretion to Hamas. But Hamas is talking about civilians. So I think we should get out whoever we can get out before there is a military incursion. We should have a ceasefire for as long as possible to relieve the crisis that exists in Gaza and all the horrible things that are happening and the innocent people who are homeless and have no food and water, etc. That needs to happen. I can't see a scenario where the ground invasion is going to be canceled by Israel, regardless if there are hostages there or not.